One other thing, Harry. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My father's will spread out across his massive desk. I was instructed to give you this. The envelope he handed me felt surprisingly sturdy. What is it? I asked without thinking. The immaculately dressed, white-haired man in front of me blinked like I'd insulted him. I was instructed to give it to you, Harry, not to look inside. I don't know why I waited until I was back in my father's silent study before opening his package. Maybe I just wanted some doors between myself and the rest of the world, with their platitudes and their pity. Besides, I felt closest to him here. The study was my father's sanctuary, and the walls told his story. Musician, stockbroker, author, sailor, inventor, artist. One of those lucky people who just seemed to have a knack for everything he tried. I did my best to tell myself that he'd led a rich and varied life, that death was a natural thing that happened to everyone. But I couldn't quite believe it. Whenever I looked at a photo of that tanned face with its salt and pepper stubble and enigmatic grin, I just wanted to feel it nuzzle into my neck in one of the boozy bear hugs that he always gave when I visited. It was like a veil had fallen between us, and the only thing still connecting him to me was the envelope. I tore it open and poured the contents into my hand. A note and a small silver key. Simone de Beauvoir, 5th shelf, 3rd from the left. Your legacy. My eyes leapt to the bookshelf. I traced my finger along the leather-bound volumes until it stopped at All Men Are Mortal. I pulled it out, leafed through. Nothing. No documents hidden in the binding or between the pages. I saw a keyhole in the wall through the gap de Beauvoir's book had left. I slipped the silver key, and with a click, the bookshelf swung outward. A secret door. Dad always did have an eccentric side. Not just a secret door, but a giant safe, I realized as I stepped over several feet of thick metal. I looked over my shoulder, paranoid that the bookshelf might slide shut, trapping me in here. I felt along the wall until my fingers grazed the light switch. Pale faces and black eyes glared at me from every angle. Wait, not faces. Masks. At least 50 of them lined the walls of the closet-sized room. Fascinated, I reached out to touch one. A half-mask with a hooked nose and thick brows that, for some reason, made me think of an elderly mathematics professor. Its surface was as cool, smooth and hard as marble, yet paper-thin. The masks weren't made out of any material that I recognized, nor did there seem to be any way to attach them. Even so, I brought the professor to my face. There was that strange sensation of disappearing beneath another set of eyes and features. Then, nothing. It balanced perfectly. Still concerned that the mask might suddenly fall, I sprinted up the stairs of the house to the mirror in my father's old bedroom. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. No mask appeared on my face in the mirror. I took it off. The professor mask appeared in my hand. I placed it on my face. The professor disappeared. I repeated this trick several times with the same result. While I wore the mask, it seemed it couldn't be perceived by anyone but me, almost as if it had melded into my face. I shuddered. Then it occurred to me that the mirror hung at an 88-degree angle. I nudged it back into place, then wandered through my father's quiet halls, thinking. Oil stocks historically shown a 12% growth at the end of the quarter. Shouldn't I be investing? I could use the money I made to buy a new timing chain for my car, since the make and model I owned statistically experienced timing failure at around my mileage point. I had some idea of what was happening. Sitting excitedly at my father's desk, I started scribbling on any piece of paper, breezing through all those equations that had been so painful in school. Halfway through one, I removed the mask. And once again, I was lost in the wall of numbers. Mask on, I solved it easily. How can I explain the next few weeks? Not only had I found the keys to my father's success, but I could even use them myself. Questioning what the masks were or where they come from hardly crossed my mind. I could do that later. After seducing Emma Shackelford at the country fair using the mask of a Playboy dancing champion, for example, the words I'd always struggled to say flowed out confidently enough through the dancer's mask's cold lips. My feet glided effortlessly across the polished floor, and for the first time I understood why the professionals described the tango as walking on air. I felt the presence of the dancer on my face, but knew that it was my eyes Emma was staring into, completely smitten. Was that sneer and the urge to let my hands wander mine or the dancer's? I couldn't say. I would have looked into the mystery then, I'm sure of it, except I found the chubby-cheeked, good-natured mask of the handyman, and my college rental apartment was in shambles. I'd always wanted to do my own plumbing, and it was so simple after all. Insert pipe A into slot B. Nothing more. Why hadn't I seen it sooner? After a long day of plumbing leaks, rehanging stuck doors and sealing drafts, I swapped the handyman for the sharp-chinned perfectionist chef. An hour later, I enjoyed a fine 3-course meal with a glass of wine. Thanks to the chef, I could finally appreciate its delicate notes and finer qualities. Curiosity got the better of me. Not curiosity to know the truth about the masks, but rather curiosity to try them all. In the few months since I'd had access to the masks, my life had improved dramatically. It felt like the world was at my fingertips, and I'd only tried the first 15. I wondered what the other abilities I'd soon find at my disposal. As far as I could tell, every mask was unique. The only thing they had in common was the strange material they were crafted from. The subtleties in their features sometimes seemed to speak to me, telling of their powers. The square-jawed, lumpy full mask of the fighter, for example, the one I used to pummel my high school bully while Emma screamed for me to stop. It was true, or the fighter thought, crushing weaker people with brute strength was too fun to just quit. I suppose at some point I allowed someone to pull me off him. I really can't recall. Yet the later masks felt different somehow, more complex. When I looked at them, I got no sense of what their speciality might be. Yet when I touched one, I felt a kind of electricity jump through me, like it wanted me to wear it. I looked deep into their empty eyes, trying to get a sense of what would happen if I did. But I found nothing. They had something, those last 20-odd masks, something that made me reluctant to put them on. But eventually, I felt like I didn't have a choice. You see, I needed the face of a lawyer. Emma had been demanding a wedding, but by then I was done with schoolboy fantasies. I'd been to New York, Tokyo, Paris. I'd known a better class of woman, the kind who understands that marriage has nothing to do with anything so pathetic as love. Rather, it is a union of bloodlines, along with all their economic and political power. I couldn't tell whether the thought of marrying a girl from my unimportant hometown made me blush or scoff, but it was all the same to me. Until Emma asked her brothers to talk with me. I couldn't stand the sight of those uppity hicks on my own father's front stoop. I had to use the fighter to push them off, and I suppose I did more harm than was strictly necessary. 2 brothers were hospitalized, and one stayed in a coma for the rest of his short life. A warrant was coming. I was sure of it. And so, I panicked. What did I know about the law? I ran through mask after mask, searching for a hint of legal expertise, until I finally reached the final 22. The moment the mask touched my face, I knew something was different. I held my hands up and turned them in front of my face, as though I was looking at them for the first time. I laughed with joy from the bottom of my guts, although I couldn't imagine what was funny about the situation. Then I watched in horror as my own fingers moved to the sides of my face and lifted me away, just to be placed on the wall, alongside the others. Well, young sir, good day to you. I suppose you might be my great-great-grandson or some such thing. The thing wherein my body said to me. Played out the rest already, have you? But goodness, that was quick. It paused, seeming to take in the information from my body. Seems you've gotten yourself in a spot of trouble. No matter, I'll hire a fine lawyer, as you ought to have done. But never fear. One day, another young inheritor will come round to take you down from the wall, and in the meanwhile, the others will impart great secrets to you, while you wait your turn. I watched my own body walk off to go about my great-great-grandfather's business. If the sounds from the rest of the house were any indication, he rather enjoyed being young again. Of course, it wasn't all fun and games. There were those blind men he hired to help him dig up my father's coffin, and the gruesome ritual he performed in order to hang Dad's face on the wall beside mine. Then there was the way I watched my own body kill those 4 blind workers to keep our family secret safe. Occasionally, a supremely talented individual was brought in to join the other masks, the ones outside the family, only used for their talents. At first, I was sickened by the sacrifices, but by my own grandson's generation, I was even looking forward to them. The light, the bright, innocent faces, the sudden splatter of red, so brilliant that not even God could make a colour so intense. Anything was better than the darkness and the whispers. It seems that my great-grandson, or rather the great-grandson of the body I lost control of when I was 21, is even more prolific than I was. He'd burned through the masks by the time he was 16. It was pure chance that he grabbed me down off the wall when he needed a face that could fix his phone instead of any of the others. No matter. All this new technology is fascinating. I can't imagine how far it will have advanced by the time my grandson gets a shot at a warm, living body again. Just imagine an electric machine that types all of humanity's knowledge at one's fingertips. I wish my father could see this, but not enough to trade places with him on the wall. Our history is quite long before we actually got together and eventually got engaged. I met her at an orphanage. She was this sweet, shy, pretty girl, and I was this dorky, socially awkward clown who tried to make everyone laugh. For me, it was love at first sight. Making her laugh made my entire day during those times, and seeing her cry would trigger emotions I never quite understood. It made me want to hurt whatever or whoever was upsetting Winter. Yes, her name was Winter. Mine was Kira. Which was strange, because I did not look Japanese at all, yet my birth certificate had Kira written on it. My birth parents abandoned me when I was 2. I don't remember much about them really. Sometimes I can see their very blurry faces with no expressions. I don't like thinking about them. They left me, so they don't deserve to live rent-free in my head. It was similar to Winter. She too was left at the doorstep of an orphanage, except the difference was there was no record of her birth, no record of her existence, and she had no name. So the orphanage gave her one. They called her Winter because she blessed the orphanage with her presence during the Christmas holidays. Eventually, though, we were separated. I was adopted into one family while she was into another. I didn't see her for over 5 years until one fateful day while walking home from school with some buddies. I spotted her. In the park, kneeling over some flowers, I instantly knew it was her. I excused myself from my friends and built up the courage to walk up to Winter. I wanted to talk to her. I missed her. "Hello," I said. She was startled by my sudden appearance behind her, so she jumped, looking at me with horrified eyes. But she didn't look scared. I couldn't quite figure it out back then. "Hi," she answered. She couldn't remember me, which was okay. She didn't need to. I could remember her. "You remember me, Kira?" Her expression softened a little and her eyes grew wide. "Kira? Kira!" she said, jumping up and hugging me. We spent the entire day in the park, just talking and catching up. It was nice. We made plans to meet again the next day, and we did. Summer was coming up, and we spent the entirety of it together. That's the summer that I found out that I really loved her. But fate had to separate us again. Her family moved away, and I didn't see her again for another 7 years. But fate and destiny have a strange way of playing with your feelings. I met her once more in college. We somehow ended up applying and getting into the same college. It was awesome seeing her again, but it did hurt so much seeing her with someone else. She had a boyfriend, Jackson. That's where all my troubles began. I really wanted to be with her, and her boyfriend was such a jackass that sometimes I just wanted to kill him. One night, while drunk at a bar, he provoked me. "I know you have a crush on Winter," he said. My heart was pounding, but I knew it wasn't that feeling of anxiety you get when you're caught in the act, caught doing or saying something embarrassing. No, this was something else. It came from the deepest pits of my conscience. It was anger. It was hate. "You can't have her," he slurred at me in his drunken state. He was barely standing up on his own 2 feet. "She's mine," he added. This was my blowing point. I wasn't really thinking straight. Anger and alcohol clouded my judgment. I do not remember what happened. I blacked out right after I threw the first swing at him. That's my last memory. I woke up in the hospital the next morning, a cast on my arm and leg. Winter was by my bedside. My bedside. Not that jerk's, but mine. Later, I learned why. We fought. The security guard threw us out, but we continued fighting. He got disorientated from taking a punch and walked out into traffic and got hit by a car. He died on impact. All of my injuries were inflicted by him. Apparently, I was quite the punching bag. I was lucky I wasn't charged with any prison time or manslaughter. In fact, they wrote the entire thing off as an accident. I really thought I was screwed this time, but somehow I came out alive, out of prison, and now I had my dream girl. She was everything that I could wish for, and we stayed together for 4 years. We moved in together during the 4th, and I proposed to her just at the beginning of the last year, 2022. It was such a magical moment. It was beautiful. We've been living together ever since, planning our wedding, and it's supposed to be happening at the end of March. We're both so excited to tie the knot. To celebrate our engagement, my surrogate parents gifted us a German Shepherd puppy. "Time to learn how to take care of someone else in the house," they teased us. They clearly wanted a grandkid, but a kid wasn't something we had discussed yet. But we did have that discussion eventually, about half a year ago. "You know, I always wanted to have a kid," Winter had said. I bobbed my head to one side and looked at her, trying to study her and figure out what she was thinking. She looked back at me. Her eyes, too, were full of wonder, full of endless possibilities. "Do you smell that?" I tried to change the topic, sniffing around. It really did smell bad, like something was rotting. I wondered where it was coming from. "Smell what? Stop trying to change the subject," she scolded me. I never had real parents, and I just told myself that if I had a kid, I would make sure to be the best parent they could ever have," she said after a long moment of silence. I couldn't say I didn't understand her. I even related to her. At some point, my deranged and hurt mind thought the exact same thing. But I soon realized that it was wrong to think that way. I realized that I only wanted a kid just to win a bet against my kid self, just to prove to myself that I can do better. And I realized that wasn't a good reason to have a kid. "I don't want to have a kid just so we can prove a point to ourselves," I responded to her. Winter's eyes grew a little wide. I could tell she didn't expect that answer. Maybe she expected that I would agree. "Are you saying you don't want to have a kid with me?" Her expression grew grim. It was like I just told her that someone died. "No, I'm saying that I don't want to have a kid just to prove a point." And then I added, "I do want to have a kid, just maybe not right now, not so soon." Her eyes were tearing up now. She was really taking this seriously. "Winter, listen, I love you. I love you so, so much. You are my world, and right now, my love doesn't have enough space to fit in a third soul." I attempted to cheer her up. She loved when I told her that I loved her. But instead, she began crying. "So you're saying that you love the dog more than you love our kid? The dog? Really?" She was trying to spit back fire. I just looked at her, wide-eyed. "You know, just screw you," she screamed at me. I couldn't really understand why she got so violent. Were kids such a touchy subject? Maybe I crossed the line. "I'm sorry," I began to apologize, but she interrupted me. "Screw you, and your apologies." She was really crying now. Winter stood up and just left. I didn't try to follow. I just let her be. We didn't really talk for a while after that fight, but we made up eventually. We both agreed to have a child. One night, about a couple weeks ago, we got into a discussion about our roots, about our origins. "You know, it's weird how you have a Japanese name, but you don't look Asian, like at all. It makes me wonder, you know," she told me while sitting cross-legged on the couch. The dog was laying at my feet. I really hated thinking about it, because it made me think of my parents, of who they were. It made me think of them like they were people, and to me, they were simply monsters. "There's an ancestry test I found online. We send in our DNA samples, and they can tell us what kind of genes we have, where we come from, you know." Her marine blue eyes were lit up with excitement. She really wanted to do this. "I don't know, Winter. I don't know if I want to know." I really was conflicted with this. I was afraid that maybe somehow I'd be disappointed. "Come on, Kira, it'll be fun." She had a puppy eyes expression on, the same expression she used on me almost every Saturday to go out for dinner, and it always worked wonders. I took a deep breath and sighed. "Fine," she squealed. "You're the best." Winter placed a hand on my shoulder. It made me smile. I was happy that she was happy. That's all that mattered. The dog got up and went into another room after Winter scooted over to me. This wasn't unusual. For some reason, that dog just didn't like Winter at all that much. Maybe because Winter was always the bad cop and I was the good cop. While I gave the dog treats, Winter gave him loud lectures. "So, how do they work?" I asked Winter. We ordered those tests online the very same night, and thanks to Amazon Prime, they came the following evening. We read the instructions and did the tests, and I mailed them out first thing in the morning while going off to work. Winter was all giddy and excited all week. She was like a kid waiting in line for the ice cream truck. I'll admit, her excitement was rubbing off on me too. And I found myself waiting for the results in anticipation as well. They came in a couple of days ago. Winter ran into the living room, holding 2 envelopes in her hand, waving them around like a trophy, with a wide grin on her beautiful face. "We got them! We finally got them!" she squealed like a little girl at a theme park. She handed me one of the 2 envelopes. It had my name and our address on it. "Come on, let's open them." She was all jumpy and giddy. It was really cute. "Oh, it says here that I'm 7% French. Maybe that's where my flirt comes from." She was reading her results out loud. "I'm 83% American, 7% Russian, 6% Polish, 3% Korean, and 1% German." I just read mine out loud in a sequence. "Special genes. It says here that I have the monoamine oxidase A gene, short for MAOA," Winter said thoughtfully. "What is that?" I asked her while looking at my own special genes section. "I don't know, it doesn't say," she replied thoughtfully. "Mine says I don't have any special genes." I was kind of disappointed. "I didn't even know they came with that. I just thought it told you your ancestry," she said, her eyes still glued on the piece of paper. I took out my phone. What was it called again? The M something? MAOA gene. Winter read it out for me. I put it into the search bar. It just says some random gibberish about it putting some sort of chemical or something into your body or brain or whatever. I was honestly not smart enough to understand this. I copied the full name of the gene, monoamine oxidase A gene, and put it into the search bar. The same thing came up. I tried searching it up a bunch of other ways to see if anything would show up, but all it said was that it was some sort of enzyme type of gene. I sighed in defeat. "Can't find anything special about your special gene, at least not in terms that I can understand," I admitted, feeling defeated. Winter finally looked up from a piece of paper. She had a smug expression on her face. "I got a special gene and you don't," she sang in a nursery rhyme type of tone, sticking her tongue out like a 5-year-old would. I just laughed. He's so childish sometimes. She gave me the "screw you" tongue. We talked about our ancestry for a while. Maybe my parents just like the name Kira, and that's all there is to it. Thinking of them just put a sour taste into my mouth, so I wanted to get this topic over with as soon as possible. But Winter's special gene still held my interest. After she went to bed, I couldn't really sleep. I continued Googling about it, going into different forums of people talking about it, of people who have it talking about it. Eventually, I discovered 2 different names for this special gene. The warrior gene, which sounded kinda cool and mighty. I love to think of my fiancée as a warrior. But it's also known as the serial killer gene, which made my blood freeze all over. What the hell did that mean? That sounded terrifying as hell. So I stayed up all night reading about it. I didn't even notice when Winter walked into the kitchen, yawning and rubbing her eyes. "Didn't find your bed today? You got up early?" she asked in between yawns. For some reason, I felt the urge to lie to her. I never had that urge before, but just this one time, I felt like telling her the truth was worse. Yeah, I got up a little early. The dog woke me. I lied. Winter nodded and walked over to the coffee machine, turning it on. Haven't had your morning coffee yet? My heart dropped. I realized I got caught. I always made a coffee. That is literally the first thing I do in the morning. I was thinking of something to say, anything to get me out of this situation. She just shrugged. Want me to brew you one as well then? Her back was facing me. Yeah, I muttered out weakly. What the hell was going on with me? Why was I acting so weird? Was I actually scared of her? Scared that she might be a killer? That's simply not possible. She's the sweetest girl I've ever known in my entire life. Winter placed the hot coffee mug in front of me and I almost jumped, startled out of my thoughts. Hey, are you okay? You look pale. There are bags under your eyes too. She had a concerned expression. I took a deep breath. This was the Winter that I always knew. The Winter that worried about me and cared and loved me. Yeah, I'm fine now. I smiled at her, trying to put on the most real smile that I could. But it felt fake on my lips. I've never felt a fake smile before. She smiled back and nodded. Good. I got up from the chair, closing the laptop. I'll take the dog for the morning walk, I announced, and Winter gave me a thumbs up, sipping on her coffee. I put on a leash on the dog and we went outside, down to the trail leading up to the park where I saw Winter for the second time in my life, where we talked for hours on end. It was a sweet memory. I also remembered her expression when I said hello. She didn't really look scared. She looked like she'd been caught doing something she didn't want others to know. I tried to explore that memory. I tried to analyze the memory I had of her expression that day, but it just blanked out whenever I tried harder. We finally got to the park. Flowers were blooming again. I walked over to the exact same spot where I saw her, trying to recall that memory, to replay it in my head. There were daisies all around the park, but I remembered this spot specifically because while we were talking, an ant bit me. It itched like hell. Looking at it now, there's an ant's nest exactly where she would have stood many years ago in this exact same park. I continued thinking about it, about what it could mean. I walked back home with the dog. Winter was no longer in the kitchen. I let the dog off the leash and he walked off, probably trying to find a nice place to sleep in. I sat back down next to the table. I could see that my laptop was moved. I opened it up. The screen still looked the same. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I took a sigh of relief. The silent house noises were making everything else louder, like my breathing, for example. I could also hear the shower running upstairs. I wrote a note that I'd be going out and left the house. I just needed to get some fresh air, not including the dog. I got into the car and just drove. I didn't really have any destination in mind, just wherever the wind would take me. And it took me to a police station. I don't know why my instincts drove me here, but I had an inkling to go inside. I had to make sure of something. I had to confirm. I walked inside the police station and asked to speak about a case. The accident Jackson and I were in, where he walked out into open traffic and died on impact. Yes, I can pull up the case file, since it's a cold case, but I'm going to need some ID. I handed the lady my ID card. She looked at it, and then at a screen. You were one of the people on the scene, she said thoughtfully. One of two. Two? I asked her, confused. It was a bar fight. Or, well, I guess, just outside of a bar fight. Why were there two witnesses? You were too far gone to make a witness statement, and Jackson died during the exchange, so the third present witness made a statement. She said you fought, and that Jackson, while trying to throw a punch at you, stumbled over into open traffic while a car was speeding by and died on impact, it was ruled an accident. While this does sound familiar to what she told me made it sound like it was my fault, made it sound like I had done it. I always had to live with that guilt. But to the police, she said that he did that to himself. This wasn't making any sense. What does Winter gain by lying to either of us? Unless she lied to both of us. My eyes grew wide. "Sir, are you okay?" I turned around and began walking away. "Sir?" she asked again in a more concerned voice. I left the building and got back into my car. My breaths were heavy and rapid. I needed to get to the bottom of this. While we lived in a big enough city, there were a couple of missing people cases in our local area, mainly single men. They were also reported to be abusive. None of their bodies were ever found. There was a pattern, but with no evidence of a crime. No proper investigation besides a missing persons case was launched, and quite frankly, nobody cared about men that abused other women. I tried to set the timeline for the disappearances. I had a suspicion. A really bad one. I was praying I was wrong. I was praying that once I got home and told my fiancé about it, we could both just laugh it off. There were 6 missing men over the course of a year. The first case happened about a month after we moved in together. I continued digging. The next was 2 months later, and the next another 2 months. There was always a delay of a month or two between each disappearance. Almost every disappearance began with them going out for drinks in a local bar, but none of the disappearances shared the same one. But I found a single anomaly. The third disappearance happened around the time when I was out of town, visiting my adoptive family for the holidays, which was around a week-long visit. My fiancé stayed behind. It was the only time when I could remember not being in town. We had our fight after I got back, our fight about the baby. I remember that strange, god-awful smell in our bedroom. It smelled like rot. She dismissed it. I remember the next day the smell was gone. My heart was pounding. Is she really? My phone rang, which startled me. It was Winter. I had to stay calm. I had to sound normal. I needed to know the truth. I needed to know, but not over the phone. "Hey honey, where are you? You left without saying a word. That's not like you." She sounded worried. "Oh, My hands were sweating. I was never a good liar. "I just wanted to get some fresh air," I said. There was silence on the other end. "I'll be back home soon," I said. "Good." I could hear her let out a sigh of relief. "I have some good news for you once you do." Her voice sounded cryptic and mysterious. I wondered what it could be. I momentarily forgot everything that I had just discovered. "Okay," I replied. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," I said back. But I wasn't sure if I meant it anymore. I drove home in silence, lost in thought. I had a million different scenarios running through my head of how this conversation could start, go and end. I didn't like a single one of them. I prayed that I was wrong. I didn't believe in God, but for the first time in my life, I begged God for me to be wrong. I parked in our driveway and headed inside. It was quiet. "I'm in the living room," I heard my fiancé yell out. As soon as I entered the kitchen, there was this god-awful smell wafting through the entire house. It smelled like a dead animal. The smell made me gag. I slowly walked into the living room, my guard up. My wife was sitting on the couch, cross-legged. She looked at me with a warm smile. "You're back," she whispered, it sounding bittersweet. I never heard her speak that way. I hated that bittersweet voice of hers. "I am," I replied, not moving from the doorway. "Aren't you going to sit?" she asked, leaving a hint of hurt in her question and expression. I just looked at her. I didn't know how to respond. I was frozen in place, standing in the doorway. This god-awful smell still invaded my nostrils. I was trying my best not to gag, especially in front of her. Not now. "What is that smell?" I avoided a question. "What smell?" she smiled back at me. I looked at her for a long time. She looked at me. I couldn't figure out what she was seeing, but her eyes were sad. "I have some good news," she finally said. "Yeah?" I wondered what she could say right now. "I'm pregnant." My ears began ringing. I was frozen in place. "I'm pregnant," a voice tumbled around in my head. "Kira?" she asked. "Aren't you happy?" She sounded hurt. "I am," I said under my breath. "Aren't you going to hug me?" She stood up then. I couldn't get the smell out of my head. What was this goddamn smell? "Okay," I said. She walked up to me. I was an entire head taller than she was. She looked up at me, the same bittersweet expression on her face as when I walked into the room. And then she put her arms around me. Her head was on my chest, and suddenly the world slowed down. I forgot all of my worries. I forgot about the smell. I forgot about my concerns. I forgot about a bittersweet expression. All I could think was that I loved her. "I have some bad news too," she said, and that brought me back to reality. My heart was pounding. My eyes noticed a blotch of red on the back of her grey socks. My eyes grew wide. I began trembling. I felt as if something sharp stabbed me in my back. "You won't see your child grow up," she whispered right into my ear. She kept hold of me. Her grip grew tighter. I could feel something wet dripping in my hands. I realized it was her tears. "Why did you have to go and do this? Why couldn't you just ignore it?" She was crying. She was sobbing. Everything sounded muffled, like I was underwater. The stab didn't really hurt anymore, but it felt itchy. I had the urge to try and itch the spot, but my hands were unmoving. They were trembling. My fiancée let go of me, and I collapsed onto my knees. I could see her pained expression through my teary eyes. I could see her say something to me, but I didn't hear it. I could no longer hear anything but the sound of ringing, and all I could smell was that distressing odor. Then, everything went dark. I awoke sometime later. Everything was dark. My entire body was in intense pain. I couldn't really move. It took some time for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I realized I was still in the living room. I used my hands to feel around my body. Everything hurt, but everything was also numb. I couldn't tell what hurt just by the pain alone. I found the knife, still stuck, wedged in my back. By some miracle, I had survived. I somehow managed to pull out my phone from my pocket and dial 911. They answered, but I couldn't speak. I had no more strength to speak. Then I blacked out again. The next time I woke up, I was in a hospital. I was alive. Luckily, the knife didn't hit any vitals, and even luckier, my attacker didn't take out the knife. I survived because the knife stayed in my body. It slowed down the rate which I was bleeding out by exponential amounts. I barely lost any blood. I was lucky, they said. But I know I wasn't. I know she chose to let me live. She's experienced. She's not sloppy enough to make such rookie mistakes, even if it's a fiancé she has to silence. I told the police everything, from what I discovered during the ancestry test to what I managed to figure out by connecting the dots. They didn't sound convinced by all my crazy theories about her being a serial killer, killing all those abusive men, but they did believe that she was the one who stabbed me, and she disappeared right after. They also found my dog. That's where the smell was coming from. I'm still in the hospital, trying to recover. They haven't been able to find any trace of her yet. Jackson's case was reopened as a murder investigation, and she's the main suspect. All of the missing men's cases have also been reopened too. A dumb ancestry test turned my life a full 180. I was supposed to be getting married this March. Now, I'll be spending that night in therapy. I really wish I'd been wrong about this. A part of me wishes that I did ignore it. Then we both could have lived happy lives and raised a child. If you ever do an ancestry test, be careful what you find out. Come on, I muttered, tapping the steering wheel nervously. I couldn't miss this. This deal was too important. My boss had claimed this was a make or break for my employment. If I was late to this meeting, I was doomed. I pulled out the pocket watch that had been gifted to me just this morning. 3:15 p.m. The meeting was supposed to start in 15 minutes, and I was an entire 30 minutes away. Traffic had been at a standstill for what felt like an eternity. The cars in front of me hadn't so much as budged in the last 10 minutes. I gripped the pocket watch tightly, subconsciously praying that I'd make it to this meeting. I put the watch back in my pocket and pulled out my phone, checking the GPS for an alternate route just in case. The screen flickered oddly, then refreshed with a newfound route. A series of some back streets that looked like they cut through the city and would get me there just on time. It looked tight, but it was my only chance by a long shot. However, based on the city's layout, it still seemed impossible to make on time. I eyed the gridlock ahead of me, my stomach clenched with frustration. I had to take the risk. I turned off the highway, and as soon as I did, the drivers behind me started honking their horns angrily. Honestly, I felt a little stupid, hoping that making it on time was possible. I drove down the suggested exit and saw that I was the only one doing so. The exit led me towards a section of the city I'd never been to. I went through a narrow street lined with old brick buildings, looking much older than the modern infrastructure that made up most of the city. The road was oddly quiet. It was the middle of the day, and as far as I was aware, this part of town wasn't known for being busy. I was making good time, but I couldn't get the nagging question of why no other drivers were taking this route. The streets around me were entirely desolate. The road ahead of me looked endless, an empty street littered with trash and moss. It looked entirely abandoned. It felt like I was all alone. The 5 minutes I drove felt excruciating, every second passing making me more and more nervous. My phone buzzed, something about losing the GPS signal. I looked down, frowning. The blue dot was frozen on the map. I smacked my phone in a cartoonish attempt to make it work again and glanced at the buildings at either side of me. Had the road been getting narrower? These back streets were like a maze. One narrow alley stretching for miles and branching paths that looked almost too tight for even a person to squeeze through, let alone a car. I drove a little farther until I realized that my suspicion was correct. The road was getting narrower. So narrow that it was getting almost too tight for my car. I cursed under my breath. The alley continued, stretching into the distance between towering, dirty brown and grey buildings. I still couldn't see where they ended. The pure vastness of this abandoned section of the town made me wonder how I'd never heard of it before. At this point, I had already given up on making it to the meeting in time. The alley was getting so narrow that I could hear a slight scraping noise as my wing mirror clashed with the rough surface of the buildings to my sides. I reversed ever so slightly, just enough to be able to get out of the car, and planned on surveying the road ahead of me. I turned the engine off, let out a heavy sigh, and stepped out of my car. The moment my shoes hit the ground below me, I regretted it. The entire alley felt wrong. The air was heavy and moist. It smelled like rust, mildew, and something I couldn't recognize. The light above me seemed to dim ever so slightly. There were no clouds in the sky, just the suffocating weight of the buildings crowding in on me on either side. The road ahead did indeed get significantly narrower, so I trudged forward. My car clearly could not pass any further, so I planned on finding the nearest business or anything helpful. I pulled my phone out to try check the signal. Nothing. My phone was useless, and the GPS app was still in the exact location where it had lost service. I stuffed it back in my pocket and decided to keep walking. I could now see more details of the roads themselves. The walls of the buildings were stained with aged graffiti and trash piled up in every corner. The strange thing was that all the packaging was faded, as if it had been there for quite some time. All the windows were either boarded up or cracked. Rats scurried between the heaps of trash, and the air took in an oppressive smell of decay, increasing in intensity the further I walked. Each footstep I made created a sickening echo through the streets. The weight of my situation was finally sinking in. I was going to lose my job, which made every single step I took heavier than the last. I would be lying if I said I wasn't already getting concerned. The frustration of the roadblock was fading away, and it was getting replaced with my fear for my future. This was my best paying job ever, and I was unsure where to go. I pulled the old pocket watch out again, the one my wife, Alexis, had given me. For good luck, she told me with a smile. It had been her grandfather's, she claimed, a family heirloom of sorts. Her grandfather told her stories of it granting wishes and attributing it to his success in life. Passed down through generations for God knows how long, and she'd insisted that I take it with me to this meeting. She said her father gave it to her after he hurt his leg in an accident, saying he can't run like he used to before, which she always thought was an odd reason. Maybe an inside joke. I laughed it off initially and pocketed it mostly out of respect. I didn't have much belief in things like wishes. I mean, just a few moments prior, I had wished to arrive at the meeting. And now, here I was. But now, I felt the weight of the watch in my hand, a little heavier than I remember it being. I flipped the watch open, its face cracked, and the hands were frozen. 3:26 p.m. It had been working earlier. I was sure of it. With a heavy sigh, I slipped the watch back into my pocket and continued walking. I glanced back and noticed that my car was now entirely out of sight. Given the road's straight nature, that was impossible. I could only imagine that the road had a slight curve to it, so slight that it was barely noticeable on foot. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, determined to check if my suspicions were correct. What I did not expect was that I would end up walking for what felt like another while with no car in sight. Then, I came to a fork in the road. The alley twisted into two paths. I was sure I hadn't seen a split in the road on my journey. I might have been too lost in my own thoughts about how screwed I was now that I wasn't making it to the meeting, so I assumed I just walked forward without looking at my surroundings. I went left, choosing what I felt was right, and hoped I was correct. As I continued walking, my sense of time was getting distorted, so I wasn't sure how long I walked. The alley wasn't as straight as I thought it was. Looking in the distance, it winded and curved without any real sense of direction. The buildings looked decrepit. Dirty walls, cracked pavement. All the buildings blended together so much that I started to feel like I was walking in circles. Yet, I kept going, telling myself the road would lead somewhere eventually. I glanced over at the countless buildings that surrounded me. I hadn't seen any sign or markings of a business, not even a restaurant or a bar. The buildings looked entirely deserted, and if they did, for some reason, house someone, I did not want to take my chances on the kind of company they'd hold. I continued on, but the road just stretched. The shadows grew darker, and the alley ever narrower. A while longer, I stopped to catch my breath. I wasn't the most athletic person, but surely I covered quite some distance during this time. This wasn't right at all. Nothing was. By now I should have made it to my car, or at this point, to the other side of the damn city at least. The sun should have been high up in the sky, but instead it was getting darker, as if twilight came early. The buildings overhead pressed ever so slightly closer. It felt like I was in a dream, another world, one that was shrinking and closing in around me. I rechecked my phone out of desperation. Dead. I couldn't even make a call. I took a deep breath in an attempt to keep calm. I had gotten here of my own accord, so there had to be a way out. I'd crossed so much distance that this couldn't just be an abandoned street or block. It felt like I was in an abandoned city that geologically shouldn't exist. I knew roughly where I was turning off when I took that exit. This place shouldn't be here. I decided to make the arduous trip to retrace my steps. I planned to go back to the first fork in the road and turn right this time and hope it led me to my car. I begrudgingly headed back the way I came. And again, the path was not the same. I was sure there had been no other forks or turns on the main road I was on, but instead of the curving alley I'd walked so long on, there were now 3 different directions ahead of me, none of which looked even remotely familiar. My heart started racing. I turned in a slow circle as panic set in. I picked a direction at random and started walking faster, almost running. My shoes hit the concrete with a sound that reverberated all around me, but the alley stretched on, longer than before. Each step I made seemed to make my surroundings more claustrophobic, and everything twisted and turned in ways that made no sense. I had no idea how long I moved like this. Minutes, maybe hours. My legs ached and my throat was dry. I stopped checking my watch on my phone. The time was always frozen at 3:26 anyway. My head was pounding and a sense of dread gnawed at me from the inside. The dark alley around me felt alive. That is the only way I can possibly describe it. The walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The turns multiplied and appeared more frequently. The road was now diverging in paths unlike before. I no longer had a straight and narrow road ahead of me, but a path that crisscrossed and intersected within itself, leading me deeper and deeper into whatever I was being led toward. I could feel it in the air, a primal instinct. This wasn't just some maze of back streets. I started jogging, then running. I figured I couldn't go on forever and wanted to be out as soon as possible. But the quicker I moved, the more disoriented I became. The alley bent in such strange ways that it sent me spiraling. I tumbled to the ground as everything became perfectly quiet, devoid of my echoing footsteps. I kept telling myself I should have been out by now, but every turn led me to a dead end or another unfamiliar stretch of streets. My breath became ragged, quick gasps, and I had to stop for a moment. I stood up and pressed my hands to my knees in an attempt to recompose. That's when I heard it. The faintest of sounds somewhere behind me. A soft shuffle amidst the silence. I stood up straight, and my heart thrummed in my chest. I looked behind me. There was nothing but an empty path. My mind raced, but then it came again from somewhere, closer this time. I worked out that the sound had to be coming from the turn ahead of me. Deep down, I hoped some other person had gotten lost there too, possibly led astray by their GPS, and was now in the same situation I was in. I know it sounds malicious to wish someone into my dire circumstance, but at least it meant I wouldn't be alone in this. I slowly made my way forward, hoping not to scare whoever was approaching. God knows I would hate it if someone sped towards me while riddled with anxiety from this place. The shuffling persisted, undeterred by my approach. It sounded like whoever was around the corner was so exhausted that they were dragging their feet on the ground. I called out to them, telling them that I was friendly and asking if they were also lost like me and that we should look for a way out together. I received no response. In fact, as soon as I spoke, the sound of shuffling ceased entirely. They must have been hesitant, understandably so. So, I hoped that approaching in a calm manner would settle them, so I gently neared the turn. Just as I was about to reach the corner, they seemed to have beaten me to it. But what came round spiked my adrenaline so hard that I span in the spot and sprinted away so fast I thought I was leaving burn marks on the floor. All I saw was its hand. A gaunt, elongated facsimile of a human hand, the proportions exaggerated in a way that told me that whatever was about to turn the corner was dangerous. Just seeing the hand was enough for a primal part of my brain to tell me a predator was about to turn the corner, and I was its natural prey. The echoing of my footsteps was no longer the only noise in this decrepit place. The air was thick and heavy, as if I were running through water. I could hear the shuffling behind me, faster and irrationally persistent. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. My lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest. Each turn I made, the shuffling behind me stayed ever close. The echoing surroundings made it hard to determine how close it was, which pushed me to keep up a pace that was too much for me. I knew I would slow soon, but I forced myself to delay that as much as my body would allow. I took turns at random, having no time to deduce a choice and knowing that the alley's layout had no logic. But somehow, I still managed to make the wrong choice. I took a blind turn and hit a dead end. The light from the gaps between the buildings highlighted my doom. I heard the shuffling behind me near the turn. It was too close to backtrack. In a matter of seconds, it would be upon me, and even thinking about what that meant was painful enough. I ran to one of the gaps between the buildings. I had stuck to the streets and their Lovecraftian logic, so God knows what squeezing between the buildings would lead to. And squeeze it was. I doubted I could even fit in, but I pushed myself in and forced my way through. The shuffling went straight for the gap, but luckily it had the same issue as me, and it slid into the gap to shuffle towards me. The gap narrowed the further I got in. I moved my head, but soon had to commit to a direction. A wash of morbid curiosity came over me, and I took a quick glimpse back. That was enough for me to keep my head looking forward for the remainder of the way. It had all the limbs of a human, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms were almost the entire length of its height, which must have been nearly 7 foot tall. Despite being further back, its closest arm reached out towards me, not helping it move, just hovering in my direction, its fingers twitching like it was ready to grab me the moment I was within range. Its other hand dragged on the floor behind it, creating a familiar shuffling sound. Its skin looked like it had a rough texture and was pale in colour. It sounded abrasive on the walls pressing in on us, resistant to any of the pointy defects of the cheap bricks that made up these buildings. A luxury I did not have. Even the smallest bumps in the walls dug into me, cutting into my suit and sometimes my skin. But I could not dwell on the minor pains when a major threat was slowly closing in on me. The pursuit continued as I finally wiggled my way to the other side. I had to get back to safety, but I was completely and utterly lost. Using the gaps of the buildings was a new idea, so I tried to keep up that creative pattern. I had not tried entering any of the buildings yet. I booked it for the building nearest to me and attempted to force the door open. I could hear the rabid thing behind me squeezing itself between the same path I had just come from. Putting solid concrete between us sounded like a bastion of safety. But the door refused to budge. The humanoid figure finally exited the tight space with a sickening pop. Adrenaline kicked back in, and I was already in a full sprint. Above my thumping footsteps and the shuffling in pursuit, I realized there was another sound. A ticking sound. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A rhythmic, soft ticking. I yanked the watch once more and stared at the cracked face. The clock hands were moving in a strange way. It read 2:11, all hands pointing in the same direction. I turned the watch, thinking it might have been broken in the tight squeeze, and the hands all turned in unison. It wasn't telling me the time. It was telling me a direction, akin to that of a compass. I continued running, and the watch adjusted as I made my movements. It was guiding me, trying to tell me something. As I ran in a single direction, the ticking of the watch started getting more frantic, and the sound of the shuffling returned to reach a crescendo. I hurried my pace with the last of my strength, but was no longer running blindly. I let the soft, steady rhythm guide me through the maze of the alleyways, a sick game of hot and cold. The creature was still behind me, its shuffling echoed in the darkness, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Eventually, I saw it. A faint red car in the distance. My car. It was still parked in the same spot where I had left it, as if nothing had happened. The moment I saw it, the pocket watch's rhythmic ticks turned wild, and the creature's pace quickened. All other senses seemed to flee my mind, and my sole focus was on running as fast as I could. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys with shaking hands. The thing was so close now that I could almost feel its damp breath on the back of my neck. I shoved the key into the lock, threw the door open, and jumped inside. I slammed the door shut as the creature reached me. The vehicle shook as the beast collided with it, and I closed my eyes in an attempt to at least grant myself the privilege of not looking at that thing again. For a moment, everything went perfectly silent. I sat there in disbelief, my breathing still rapid from the long sprint I had to maintain. The heavy breathing must have been too much for me, or the panic finally set in, because I passed out. When I woke up, I was parked in my spot at the office building's parking space. I checked my phone out of habit and saw the time. 3:28 p.m., 2 minutes before my meeting. Seeing I was on time for the meeting overtook the shock of remembering my phone had died. I corrected my posture as I raised myself up. I didn't waste any time. I pushed the car door open and headed towards the meeting room. I still don't quite know what happened or how I got out, but I knew the watch was connected to it. I distinctly remember holding it while stuck in traffic and wishing I could make it to the meeting in time. And lo and behold, I did. I've been back on the same freeway I was stuck on before the meeting, and there isn't an exit where I remember turning off the road. I pulled over in a lay-by, and no matter how many times I checked, there was no alternative routes from that spot. It seemed my wish had come true, as my grandfather-in-law had told my wife, but it came at the cost of this chase. And now, it finally made sense why it was passed on to her when her father hurt his leg. My great-grandfather was the kind of man who always seemed unshakable. He had lived through a world war, raised 4 kids of his own after his wife passed, and ran a small-town diner until arthritis stole his grip. He was a figure of quiet strength, with the eyes of someone who'd seen the world and survived. Growing up, I knew he'd served as a nurse during the war, but that was about all I knew. Most of his stories gathered dust in his memories, just like the medals that stood on the living room shelf. He'd sometimes joke about trading cigarettes for coffee or patching up cowardly soldiers who shot themselves in the foot. But there was a line he would never cross. He always kept the heavy memories locked out of sight. It was late, past midnight, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen, accompanied by a grandfather clock. Great-grandpa and I sat at the table, the dim yellow light above us casting long shadows across his worn, weathered face. He poured himself a whiskey, the one indulgence that remained, and handed me a Coke, a gesture that made me feel much older than I was. He was quiet at first, staring into his glass like it held something he'd been trying to figure out. Then, without looking up at me, he spoke. "You ever wonder why some things stick with you, boy?" he asked with a low and steady voice. I blinked and adjusted my posture, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" He took a sip from his glass and set it back down carefully, his hand lingering on it. "The war. I've seen a lot of things, fixed a lot of people up, buried more than my share too." He paused and glanced at me before setting his gaze back down to his glass. "But there's one man I've never been able to forget." He leaned forward, careful not to break the moment. Great-grandpa rarely talked like this, and I respected him too much to even think about interrupting. "Private Andrew Mallory," he said, his grey eyes sharp but distant, as if reliving the memory in front of me. I waited, letting him find his words. "He came to us in the winter of '44, Grandpa began. "We were stationed at the hospital just behind the front lines. It was freezing, the kind of cold that would kill you if you stopped moving for too long. The air stank of smoke, blood, mud, and gunpowder." He paused, his jaw visibly tightening. "The hospital wasn't even much of a hospital," he said with a dry chuckle. "A few canvas tents and a whole lot of desperation. We worked with no breaks, patching up the ones we could and making the others comfortable until they no longer needed the comfort." He picked up his glass again and took a slow sip. "That's where I first met Mallory. They brought him in late one night, carried on a stretcher by two boys who didn't look much older than he was. Shrapnel wound to the gut. It was bad, son. Real bad. We tried to save him, but..." His voice trailed off, and his hand tightened around the glass. "He died on the table. I was holding his hand when it happened. I remember, clear as day, the way his grip loosened, the look in his eyes when he realized he wasn't gonna make it. He was just a kid, scared, alone, dying in the middle of a frozen hell." He fell silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the table between us. "What happened after that?" I asked quietly. Great-grandpa exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping as he leaned back in his chair. "The same thing as always. We cleaned him up as well as we could, tagged him, and sent him to the morgue tent. Then we moved on. There wasn't time to dwell on anything back then. Too many men coming in and not enough hands to save them all. We had no time to mourn. We just did what we could and hoped it was enough." I nodded, even though I couldn't imagine what sort of pressure he must have felt. "The next morning," he continued, his voice softer now, almost ghostly, "I walked into the triage tent, same as always. And there he was." I frowned. "Who?" "Mallory," my great-grandfather said, his eyes meeting mine. "Standing there like nothing had ever happened. He was fine, better than fine even. No wounds, no blood, not a scratch on him. Just standing there, confused as hell, but in better condition than anyone in that hospital." A slight chill ran down my spine. I never heard my great-grandfather tell a story like this. I didn't even think he believed in anything supernatural. "And what did you do?" "What could I?" he said. I thought I was losing my mind. I went over to him, my eyes wide as dinner plates. I clearly scared the kid with the way I walked up to him, but I half expected him to collapse or disappear into thin air the second I touched him. But he didn't. He was solid, as real as the kid I'd watched die the night before. He rubbed his hand over his face. The other nurses thought it had to be a mistake, that we'd misidentified the body or mixed up the tags. It wasn't too uncommon. But I knew. I held his hand when he died. "What did Mallory say?" I asked, curiosity gripping me tightly. "Not much," he admitted. "He was confused, disoriented, said he didn't remember anything after the explosion. The doctors checked him over and he was fine, with no wounds or signs of trauma. They got him ready and sent him back to the front." "Just like that?" I asked, my voice rising. Just like that, boy, Great-Grandpa said with a bitter tone. Orders were orders, and he was a soldier. If he could stand, he could also fight, and that's all that mattered. He fell silent again, his gaze drifting toward the darkened window to our left. The kitchen felt colder than it had a moment ago, and I realized I was holding my breath. I couldn't let it go, he said with a subdued tone. After I saw Mallory there, alive and well, I couldn't just move on. I tried to talk about it. Hell, I had to. Who did you talk to? I asked. Mary Ellen, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She was one of the senior nurses. She was hard as nails, but she had a good head on her shoulders. A damn fine woman she was. I figured if anyone would listen, she'd be the one. He let out a long sigh. I caught her between shifts. She was smoking behind the supply tent, trying to get some minutes to herself before the next truck pulled up. Great-Grandpa's voice softened once more, and I could also see the scene in my head as he described it. She stood there, leaning against the tent pole, staring at me like I told her the world was ending in just a few minutes. What do you mean he walked back in? She asked. I told her everything, just as I had told you. What did she say? I asked, louder than I'd meant to. She laughed, he said flatly. The kind you give someone when you're too tired to deal with nonsense. I told her I wasn't crazy and I knew what I saw. I said, Mary, that kid was dead. He died in front of me. But she just shook her head and said, Dead men don't walk, Harold. Maybe you tagged the wrong boy. We've all made mistakes. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass, the liquid inside never seeming to end. I asked her if she'd at least take a look at him, see for herself. She took one last drag of a cigarette, blew the smoke out and said, We don't have time for this. There's a truck coming in with 20 more boys, and I doubt half of them will make it longer than a night. I frowned, trying to picture the situation in my head. That's it? She just shrugged it off like that? War doesn't leave room for questions, kid, he said with a heavy voice. Not questions like that. Anyway, I knew that myself. We were barely keeping up as it was. Soldiers pouring in faster than we could treat them, supplies running out. When you're drowning, you don't stop to wonder why the water is rising. He set his glass down hard, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. She told me to get back to work, and that was that. Mallory was just another name, another body. Nobody cared where he'd been or how he came back. They just cared that he could hold a rifle. The bitterness in his voice cut deep, and I didn't know what to say for a moment. Did he come back? I asked finally, already knowing the answer. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he came back. He stared at the ceiling for a moment before looking at me with kind eyes. But that's enough for tonight. I'm tired. I opened my mouth to protest, to ask just one more question, but I realized Great-Grandpa wasn't asking. He was telling me the conversation was over for now. I'll tell you the rest tomorrow, kid, he said, rising from his chair, followed by the faint creak of the old wood. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying Great-Grandpa's words over and over. The gravity in his voice sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to know more. Images of a war-torn hospital filled my mind, The smell of antiseptic and blood, the groans of the dead and dying, the frantic shuffle of nurses trying to save lives. And then, Mallory. The thought continued to gnaw at me the next day at work. I tried my best to focus, but my mind kept drifting. I ran through everything Great-Grandpa had said, wondering how it could be possible. I was still lost in thought when my phone rang. The vibration in my pocket snapped me back to reality. The voice on the other end was rushed and panicked. "Your great-grandfather has been hospitalized," the woman on the other end said. "Heart attack." My stomach dropped. I barely remembered grabbing my keys, talking to my boss, and driving to the hospital. When I got there, he was lying in bed, pale and hooked up to more machines than I could count. His eyes opened when he heard me enter, and he gave me a weak smile. Great-Grandpa's hand trembled as he reached out, beckoning me closer. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. His voice was hoarse and strained, but its urgency left no room for argument. "Didn't think you could get rid of me that easily, did you?" he rasped. I laughed softly. "You scared the hell out of me, Grandpa." "Sit," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I need to finish the story." "Grandpa, it's fine. You need to rest." "No," he interrupted, his tone firm, unexpectedly so. "I don't know how much time I have. Just listen." I nodded, pulling the chair closer to his bedside. His hand gripped mine, the warmth contrasting with the cold sterility of the hospital. I listened without saying a word, leaning forward to catch every syllable. Something in his tone demanded my full attention. "After Mallory came back the first time," Grandpa began once more, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, "I just couldn't stop thinking about it. It made no sense. I tried to keep going, hoping the world would explain itself later." His fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. I tried thinking back on what Mary had said, that it was just a mix-up, a mistake. But deep down, I knew better. He paused, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Time went by, weeks passed, and I didn't see him again. I figured that was the end of it. But then, they brought him back. He shifted slightly, wincing as he adjusted his position. I remember the look on the medic's face when they carried him in. They said he'd stepped on a mine. His leg was gone, blown clean off. Shrapnel had ripped through his chest, and his skin was burned so badly he didn't even look human. "What happened then?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Great-Grandpa shook his head. "We tried to stop the bleeding, pulled the shrapnel, did everything we could to keep him alive. But it was a losing battle from the start. We all knew it. His heart gave out halfway through, and he died again." His voice trembled, and he turned his head to look at me. "Do you know what it feels like to fail someone twice, boy? To watch a kid die in your hands, knowing there's nothing you can do?" I was unable to find the words. We cleaned him up, tagged him again, and sent him to the morgue tent. It had to be over, and I hoped it was, for his sake. The next morning, Grandpa said, his voice growing quieter, I walked into the triage tent to start my shift. And there he was, again. His expression darkened. The first time I saw him come back, I thought I was losing my mind. This time, I didn't quite know what to think. He was sitting on one of the cots, staring at the floor like he didn't know where he was. And he looked fine, just like before. "Did you talk to him?" I asked. Grandpa exhaled, his hands clenching the blanket tighter. I froze. For a moment, I just stared at him. Part of me wanted to run up to him and ask what the hell was going on, but I didn't. Why not? "Because the tent was a madhouse," he said bitterly. "More men had been brought in overnight, and there were too many fires to put out. I didn't have time to sit and ask questions as much as I wanted to." His eyes clouded over, his voice turning softer. I did manage to catch his eye, though, for just a second. And you know what I saw? Fear. He was scared out of his mind, but confused. "They sent him back to the front line later that day," Grandpa said. I could feel the frustration radiating off him as he spoke. "I wanted to stop him," he admitted, "to pull him aside and make him tell me everything. But I didn't get the chance. I didn't even see him for a long time after that. The war moved on, unrelenting." He looked at me then, his eyes heavy. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see his face, that fear, that confusion, and I kept wondering. Wondering what? Grandpa hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. I kept wondering where he went when he died, what he saw, what it was that scared him so much. The door opened suddenly, and a nurse stepped in, her voice soft. "I'm sorry, visiting hours are over." "Wait," I said, turning back to Grandpa. "You said there was more. What happened next? Did he come back?" Grandpa lifted a hand, his fingers weakly waving me off. "Later," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'll tell you the rest later." "Grandpa." "Go home," he said, his eyes fluttering shut. "We'll finish tomorrow." The nurse gave me a sympathetic smile as she ushered me out. But something about Grandpa's final words left a pit in my stomach. As I walked out of the hospital, I couldn't shake Great-Grandpa's words, and a small part of me began to question it all. His story about Private Mallory was by all means impossible. People do not just die and come back, let alone multiple times. Maybe, I thought, it was his way of coping with his own mortality, a metaphor for something he couldn't quite explain to me. Or maybe he was trying to teach me something about resilience and sacrifice. Still, the way he spoke and the emotions in his voice all felt real. There was a sincerity to it. The morning after, I thought about calling the hospital to check on him. He was old and tired and needed rest, but I planned on seeing him after work. Given the seriousness of the story, he would prefer to tell it in person. I had just gotten home from work when my phone rang. The number was from the hospital. "Your great-grandfather has just passed away. It was sudden but peaceful," the voice on the other end said. "I'm so sorry for your loss." She sounded comforting, but with so much unanswered, I was distraught. I asked him to repeat it, hoping I misunderstood. But I hadn't. My great-grandpa was gone. I went to the hospital to sign off documents and pick up his remaining things. Deep down, I hoped to find some clues to the ending of his story, or maybe even a manifesto explaining the rest. But all he had with him was the clothes on his back. I left the hospital feeling lost, both emotionally and physically. One way or another, I ended up at the diner where great-grandpa and I used to go when I was a kid, the one he used to own back in the day. It was a place that felt safe and familiar, a setting to remember him by. I slid into the booth where Grandpa and I always sat, and I stared at the familiar chipped laminate table as the hum of the diner's lights buzzed faintly in the background. I did not even notice the waitress asking if I wanted coffee. I just nodded along. When 2 mugs hit the table, I looked up and froze. Sitting across from me, in front of the other mug of steaming coffee, was my great-grandfather. He looked tired, his face exhausted and withdrawn, but there was no mistaking it. He raised the mug slightly, like a toast. "Don't panic, son," he said in a calming tone. I internalized my reaction to scream and got up slowly, keeping my eyes on him as I slid into the seat across from him. "You're alive." "I know," he interrupted as he sipped his coffee. "You wanted to know what happened the 3rd time Mallory came back," he added. I kept staring at him, my mind a swirling pit of confusion and disbelief. "How? I got the call. They said you..." "Died," Grandpa said, finishing the sentence for me. "I did, son. That's the problem. It's my 2nd time now, so this is when things change." Before I could press further, he leaned in. "The last time Mallory came back, he was different. They carried him into the tent half dead, with burns, shattered bones, and parts of him barely held together. But he didn't die. He should have. God knows he should have. But something did not let him." Grandpa slumped back in his chair, his expression turning dark. But he hung on, barely. The damage to his body was... Grandpa trailed off, shaking his head. Everyone said it and knew it. The other medics looked at him like they were waiting for his heart to stop, but it just never did. He laid there, breathing shallow, his eyes wide open. I stayed quiet. "They got him stable eventually," he continued, "stable enough to move him to a recovery tent. I had to know more, son. I couldn't get it out of my head. The look on his face when we were working on him, it wasn't just pain." He scratched at his forearm, wincing slightly. "I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about him, wondering if he was still alive, still hanging on. So, I broke protocol, slipped out of my bunk, and went to see him." Grandpa's voice dropped lower, and his hands tightened around the mug. "When I got there, I saw it. His wounds, they weren't healing. They were getting worse. But it wasn't just blood and burns anymore. There was something else. This black goo seeping out of his injuries, spreading over his skin like it was alive. I felt a chill creep up my spine. He saw me standing there," Grandpa continued, and his eyes locked onto mine. He looked at me like I was his last chance. He reached out, barely able to lift his hand, and said, "You have to end it. Please, I can't go back again. I can't let it take me." Grandpa swallowed hard, his voice trembling now. I told him I couldn't, that I wouldn't. I was there to save people, not kill them. But he kept begging, tears streaming down his face, his voice breaking. "It's in me," he said. "It's going to take everything. Please, don't let me turn into it." My chest tightened. "What did you do, Grandpa?" "I didn't want to do it," Grandpa admitted. But I knew he was right. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't natural. It wasn't going to stop. It was spreading. I didn't have a choice. I had failed to save the kid twice. I wouldn't fail again. Grandpa looked up at me then, his eyes filled with quiet, terrible guilt. I pressed my hand over his nose and mouth and held it there until he stopped breathing. Grandpa leaned back in the booth, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the table. I thought it was over after that. I thought I'd done what needed to be done. Whatever was in him was tenacious. It didn't want to go with him. What seeped out of him like an ooze fizzled as Mallory's heart stopped, and before I could get away, it burst into a mist. I managed to back away from it, but I breathed a bit of it in. Only a bit. But it was enough. A look of defeat crossed my grandpa's face, a rare look to see. I was found still, declared dead on the spot. When I walked in the next day, there was too much chaos to investigate, so it was just reported as a clerical error. No marks were found on me, so my medical records just show an undetected heart murmur. That was my first. Grandpa sighed. Since then, I've lived carefully. I don't know how many chances I have, but this heart attack was the second. I can't risk you or anyone around me. Before, I was desperate to know what Mallory knew, but seeing it myself, I now know why he craved death. He lifted his arm slightly, pulling back the sleeve of his shirt. Just above his wrist, a small patch of black, oily substance clung to his skin. "It got to me," he said simply. "Whatever was inside Mallory passed to me. And now, it's waiting. I can feel it spreading little by little, but I don't know what I'll turn into. But I know it won't be me." I was stunned. Hearing this story was just words, but seeing the strange substance in person made it all too real. "I'm sorry, kid," Grandpa said, his voice breaking. "I didn't want you to know, but I couldn't leave without telling you the truth. You deserve that much." I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. There has to be a way to stop it, Grandpa," I pleaded. Grandpa gave me a sad, tired smile. "Maybe, son, but it's not a risk I'm willing to take around you or anyone else." He pushed back from the table, his movement slow. "Take care of your siblings and your mother for me," was the last thing he said. I wanted to stop him, to say something, but the words caught in my throat. I could only watch as he walked out of the diner, and the weight of everything that had transpired came crashing down on me. My flock of 32 lambs in my newest and southernmost paddock were a mix of newly bought and some from my own lot. With only 2 rams last November due to unfortunate cases of fly strike, I had lost a few rams and my new ewes had not birthed many lambs during spring. I was fortunate that one had birthed quads, each with a white dot on their foreheads. 4 healthy lambs from one mother ewe is a rare sight. A local farmer, Jonathan, had suggested a farm vet who had arrived in all black and supplied supplementary milk. I had to bottle feed them 4 times a day as the poor mother couldn't keep up with milk production. Sadly, one of the lambs passed away between morning feeds. An unknown cause had taken it. "The land taketh what you oweth," Jonathan whispered. At first, I thought it was just old farmer talk for, "I'm sorry for your loss." Incineration, though a standard process for dead livestock, felt far too cruel for a baby, so I buried the body deep in my fields with the rest of them. I hoped that my good treatment of the creatures would visit me back in good karma and nutritious grass for my livestock. The triplets, now 6 months of age, reside in the paddock I mentioned earlier. With their late birth, they are too young to breed and are separated from the ewes, ready for the new season. They sit larger than the rest. It was a sign that the supplementary milk had done them well and I'd fed them correctly. A proud achievement of mine. I'm relatively new at farming. The land I now own belonged to a relative on my dad's side and was eventually passed on to him. The land he had owned, yet not wanted, was given to me after his death. It took a lot of work and money to renovate it, and I've received a lot of support from the nearby farmers since then, even if they did find it strange that I suddenly wanted to become one of them. After months of intense studying to ensure the animals I raised would be treated well, I ultimately decided to start it easy with sheep. Unfortunately, I underestimated just how difficult they can be. 2 weeks ago, I visited the lambs in the morning to find them walking non-stop in an almost perfect circle. They had been doing it throughout the night, as the autumn grass had been worn down from their trotters. I even entered their flight zone, which usually would have sent them fleeing from me. However, the lambs continued their march with their lower halves coated in mud and their eyes hazed. Not even my farm dog, Holly's barking and nipping could snap them out of it. In fact, they almost crushed her. The other farmers and I had suspected listeriosis, aka circling disease, but it became a mystery when the other paddocks were not affected despite feeding on the same supplementary hay. It was as if their flock mentality had activated and they were trying to flee from something. With people I didn't know arriving to see the lambs, it became an area mystery. Even local news took an interest in the matter. However, nobody yielded a solution. In the early days, I released one of my mentally stronger, older ewes into the paddock, hoping the lambs would sense her seniority and break away from their trance. At first, she stayed clear of the group and grazed at the grass, but eventually, she too was drawn to the circle, as if magnetized. The other farmers were unsure of what to do. This behavior had been reported as common with sheep left in pens for too long, but with the vast paddock to themselves, it just didn't make sense. Jonathan had lent me a few of his farm dogs to try and break the circle up, but they remained tightly packed and unresponsive. I reached out to multiple vets, unable to track down the one that had helped me with the quads. In fact, Jonathan helped me with a lot of things, even going so far as to give me a ewe to aid with my lambing. Each vet that visited suggested listeriosis. Some of the vets had theorized that the soil in the paddock had become contaminated. Nonsense. I told them that the lambs had access to my supplementary hay as frost began to claim the fields during the night and dawn. November's cold rain flooded the fields and created thick mud. Day by day, the lamb's pathing formed a moat around the central path of grass. Despite everything, The patch of land in the middle remained dry. Some of the lambs began to pass away by day 10. Their starved and tiny bodies were stampeded and crushed to a pulp by the remaining, yet dwindling numbers. Soon enough, the moat had become so deep that I could only see the top of their heads. The farmers came by every other day, equally intrigued. They'd watch on with focused eyes and raised brows, as if the sight triggered deep thought. Each day, they witnessed a drop in the numbers of lambs, but none of them would offer their condolences. With fewer live lambs, I used the pulley system to lift the corpses out of the ground. Most of them were floppy, their bodies the consistency of beanbags with their broken and crushed bodies, some ripped apart from days of lying at the bottom. Once cleared, we used the system to trap a live lamb and lift them out. When we had gotten it to the surface, the lamb flipped out. Its body swung around violently as if it tried to get back into the pathing, and when restrained, it whipped its head around so wildly that it intentionally broke its own neck. "Things like this happen. The land taketh what you oweth," Jonathan assured me. His voice was calm and soothing. "Did you speak to my guy?" he asked. "I never got his number after his visit. Do you think you can call him?" "I'll give it a try. He's hard to reach." When I visited the paddock this morning, their air was thick with moisture. The fog was suffocating and foreboding. It almost felt as if I was drowning. The grass under my feet felt soft, as if the damp air had mixed with the mud and softened it. Between phlegmy coughs, I peered into the moat. At first, I heard nothing, with just 4 lambs, including the triplets, alive. Just the night before, I was doubtful they would make it through the night. And then, I heard it. A wet, slippery noise filled the air. It sounded like somebody squishing a saturated sponge repeatedly. As I crouched down to the moat, it grew louder, and despite my efforts to focus my eyes through the fog, I could only see dark blobs moving below. My feet shuffled away from the edge, fearing a mysterious figure would come from the fog and push me in if I leaned closer. An intense bleat sounded. It was harsh and loud, yet muffled, like it came from under the surface, and suddenly a rhythmic thudding echoed from below. My flashlight illuminated the water droplets in the air and revealed the faint shadow of one of the lambs. I watched as it repeatedly slammed its head into the dirt, 2 other thumps in the distance following after each other. Instinctively, I shrieked and tried to reach the depths below to stop the lamb, only for my fingertips to brush up against the now soil coat of the creature below. I recognized the material as one of the bigger dog coats I had to give the triplets due to their size. Crackling trickled into my ears, almost like a faulty electrical wire or the sound of water on hot oil. At first, it was practically impossible to hear it over the thudding, but it soon grew louder and louder, and was quickly accompanied by strange vibrations in the ground. And I noticed the central island began to crack and break. I pushed myself back onto my feet and took a few steps back, afraid that the cracks would infect the ground I stood on and swallow me up. I watched as the center caved in like a sinkhole. The hole grew bigger, swallowing up the remaining dirt until there was just one giant hole inside of the moat. Suddenly, the air became light. No more cracks, no more thudding. Nothing. Time itself stood still, while my rapidly beating heart created the soundtrack of my panic. And so, with unsteady feet, I approached the hole yet again. I feared that the remaining lambs had gotten stuck in with the muck, and my worry for them triumphed against my frightened nature. To my surprise, the 3 lambs remained stood in place. A small mud mound remained. The lump wriggled and squirmed as if something was trapped underneath, Fearing that it was one of my lambs and that it would soon suffocate, I jumped in. I clawed at the damp dirt, the muck coated my hands and crawled under my nails, until I finally hit something ice cold. It was a small lamb, less than a month old. Not one of mine. After all, lambs are only birthed in the spring. Initially, it appeared to be dead, with the same dot as the triplets. I was almost sure it was the lamb I buried just months ago. But when it stood up on all fours firmly, I was almost sent into shock. I felt the need to cover it with a blanket and warm it up. However, something about the lamb seemed strange, as if it was controlling the air around me, as if we were both the same end of a magnet. I stumbled back from the force, almost tripping over one of the hoof crevices on the pathing. The remaining 3 lambs stepped forward and lay before the middle one. The act was practically cultish, or sacrificial. There was a sense of purpose in their movement, as if they'd been working up to this moment. "Hey," I called out, followed by a whistle. They didn't spare me a glance. I knew that they had heard me. There was something different in their behavior now than earlier. They seemed to have woken up from the trance they'd been in over the past few weeks. Frantically, I scanned the surrounding area. It was doubtful somebody would be in my land, but after these 2 weeks, my place had become a hotspot. Just beyond the fence of the paddock and through the lessening fog stood a dark figure dressed in black. Perhaps another farmer had arrived to check for any updates. I opened my mouth to call out to them, but found myself lost for words. What was I shouting for? What was the emergency here? An impactful crack flooded the area, followed by a few less harsh ones. I turned my head and witnessed in horror as the smaller lambs stomped apart one of the triplets' heads. And although I'd come across plenty of corpses these past several days, this was different. My mouth flooded with saliva, and stomach acid soon followed, the pressure too much for my lips to hold back, and soon enough I painted the ground with my insides. When I looked back, the lamb had begun to feast on the viscera. "Stop!" I screamed, my hands waving dramatically in the air to seem huge and intimidating. "Stop it!" My throat burned as I cried, still coated with a mix of last night's meal and drinks. The lamb did not listen, and with the intense force pushing up against me, I could only watch on in disgust as it turned to another one of the triplets and did the same. In just seconds, it all became too much. Erratically, I climbed out of the hole and searched the surface for help, but the figure was gone. I was alone. "Help," I called through the moisture. "Please, come back." The skull burst and cracks echoed again as the lamb made contact with its final target. I didn't have to look. I couldn't. Feeling helpless, I ran. No matter how far I fled from the scene, I couldn't escape the images in my head. The atrocity which happened right in front of me was barbaric, unexplainable, and left my stomach in knots. When I'd created a large distance from the hole, I spared a look back, my feet still stumbling ahead of me. Through the fog, multiple figures stood eerily around the site, staring into the crater below. It was difficult to make out any identifying features. Suddenly, the surrounding ewes and rams in the remaining paddocks began bleating in unison as the shadows around the hole shifted and moved. I didn't stick around for longer, fearing I owed the land much more than I could ever give it. My mother picked me up from the airport in the dark hours of the morning. It had been a long flight and an even longer year. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the ranch house I grew up in looked like a little black shipwreck sticking out of the fog. Why is the kitchen light on? I wondered. Mom lives alone. We're here, boy. Oh, yes, we are, my mom shouted as she opened the door. That's odd, I thought. Is she talking to me? I rolled my luggage into the dark hallway. I didn't really need a light after all. I knew the place by heart. The jet lag was hitting hard, and I barely managed a hug and a simple conversation before I had to drag myself off to bed. I heard Mom's muffled voice from the kitchen as I drifted off to sleep. It was a sweet, cooing sort of sound, the tone of voice you'd use with a baby, or a pet. By the next morning, I'd forgotten all about it. I chugged black coffee and chomped on cereal while my mother and I tried to plan our visit. We'd always been close, but since I landed my dream job teaching in Japan, we only saw each other about once a year. We had to make it count. Well, that should be fine, my mom responded to the day trip I proposed, as long as I'm home in time to let Cooper out. Sorry, Cooper? Another thing about being away from people for a long time, differences that you might not notice otherwise, like aging or personality changes, really stand out, and they tend to be changes for the worse. I felt a pang of guilt looking around the place. It looked more small and worn down than I remembered. Oh, silly, you know, Mum winked. Cooper, the dog. I didn't know you'd gotten a dog. There it was again, that feeling of time slipping by. Really? Mom scrunched up her eyebrows. I thought for sure I mentioned it. Well, I'm sure you'll meet him while you're visiting. I hope you two get along. I do too, I thought, frowning. Truth was, I didn't really like dogs all that much, and I was pretty sure that feeling was mutual. I know how attached some people get to their pets, but when I look into a dog's forward-facing predator eyes, my first thought is, creatures like this used to hunt and eat creatures like me. I peered out the blinds at the dead grass and leaning shed outside. Two shining stainless steel bowls glinted in the winter sun. So, is Cooper out back or... Oh, I don't know. He comes and goes. I squinted at something across the way. A missing pet poster stuck to a telephone pole. It was for a cat, though. As I got us packed and bundled up for our day trip, my eyes fixed on a new addition to the house I hadn't noticed in the dark. Either it was a black rubber dog door built for a big dog. My eyes fixed on a new addition to the house I hadn't noticed in the dark either. It was a black rubber dog door built for a big dog. Each time it rattled in the wind, a shiver ran up my spine. When we finally pulled out of the driveway, I realized that I was actually relieved to be leaving my home behind, without a sign of Cooper. We arrived after dark, hungry and tired from too much driving with too many stops. I went straight for the kitchen to prepare dinner, and I was so focused on chopping vegetables that at first I didn't notice the strange sounds coming from the living room. There we go. Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy? Leaning around the corner, I saw my mom bent over in a rocker, making a stroking motion. Cooper, I figured. Odd that I hadn't heard him come in. Mom and Cooper were still at play when I finished the jambalaya. Or so I thought. But when I turned the kitchen corner, my mom was staring dead ahead at the TV. There was a program on about a pair of kids who'd gone missing from a playground a few blocks away. Mom, I ventured. Can I help with Cooper? Thanks anyway, dear. My mother nodded and took the steamy bowl out of my hand. But he just ran off. I'm sure he's around here somewhere. He comes and goes. Yeah, you mentioned that. I was beginning to feel uneasy again, but I still couldn't say why. Don't you think it's kind of odd that he hasn't come out to, I don't know, greet me or something? You're the first new person Cooper's known besides me. Mum sighed happily as she dug into her dinner. Maybe he's just shy. That may have been true, but for the first time, I found myself unable to relax or unwind while visiting home, and it was all because of this unseen, unknown presence that just might pop up at any time. Where does Cooper usually hang out? I asked after a few hours of movies, snacks, and what's new with everybody chit-chat. I think I'd like to say hi. It makes sense that a shy dog would hide in the basement, right? I tried to reassure myself as I descended the stairs. The scuffed up wood brought back childhood memories. In those memories, I always seemed to be running up them as fast as I could, terrified of what I'd see if I looked back over my shoulder. But I was an adult now, standing with my shoulders square at the bottom of the steps, ready to turn on the light. And there was nothing to be afraid of, right? I gave the chain a tug. The basement didn't seem like it had changed at all since I was a kid. Same dented filing cabinets, rusty cans, old appliances, a smell like dust and oil, and wet fur. Cooper? I whispered. I felt like a fool. I tried again, a little louder. Cooper, here boy, Cooper. The cellar's damp and chill sank into my bones as I waited for a response. Nothing. With a sigh, I clicked off the bulb, started up the stairs, and heard something large padding around in the dark. With a start, I rushed back down, yanked on the light chain. Again, nothing. But I'd heard something out there among the cobwebs and covered furniture. I was sure of it. I waited a solid minute before heading back, defeated. The movement started again when I was about halfway up. That is, just as far from the upstairs light as the one downstairs. This time, it wasn't just skittering around. It was charging. The bulk of something much heavier than I was made the wooden steps creak and groan in the pitch blackness behind me. I ran as fast as I could, but even so, I felt hot, panting breaths on my shins before I burst into the light of the kitchen. Mom looked at me curiously. Heh, I gasped. 20 years later, I guess I'm still scared of the basement, huh? Without a word, my mother turned back to the blue glow of the TV. Apparently, there was no sign of the two missing children. Although I went to bed early that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept waiting to hear movement from the basement or the rubber door flap. I'd almost drifted off when I got my wish. The clatter of the flap, the clack of paws on a hard surface coming down my bedroom hallway. The sound got closer and closer, then seemed to pass right through my locked door. Whatever it was in the room with me. I sat up straight and turned on the light. I could hear its steps all around, and it sounded too big to hide. So, where was it? It was only when my instincts made me look up that I saw the muddy paw prints being tracked in circles on my bedroom ceiling. A chill ran down my spine, that scared prey sense that comes from being watched by unseen eyes. The invisible thing on my ceiling stopped, then growled. What the? I ran out of the room, heavy paw steps fast behind. I cried out to my mother, who had dozed off in a recliner. The growling behind me deepened, then stopped. Mom sat up and put on her glasses. Oh, she smiled. I see you've met Cooper. What? I wheezed. I heard panting and the sound of a wagging tail scraping across the floor. What the hell was this? I watched invisible paws sink into the carpet as the panting thing padded over to my mom, Its growls turned into happy yelps as, I guessed, my mother scratched its belly. "Who's a good boy?" my mom cooed. I crept closer. "Mom?" I didn't know how to begin. "Do you see anything?" A snarl and a chomping sound cut me off. I felt, rather than saw, that something big had sprung to its feet before me and raised its hackles. Had a set of invisible jaws just snapped by my hand? "Oops," my mother cautioned. "It seems like it's still not used to you." I backed away until I was in the hallway, ready to run, then shouted, "There isn't a dog there. I don't know what you've got there, but it isn't a dog." "Don't be silly. Of course, Cooper is a very good boy. Yes, he is." The pleased yipping and whimpers resumed. It was more than I could take. I went back to my childhood bedroom, slammed the door and locked it. Not that it would do any good. When the noises finally stopped, I assumed my mother had gone to bed. I tried to keep any darker possibilities out of my mind because, as concerned as I was for her, the truth was that I was too scared to check, too scared of what might happen if I ran into that thing alone in the dark of the hallway, without my mother's apparently protective influence. I sat up in bed with the light on and an open pocket knife clutched in my fist, not like that would do much good against an invisible creature with claws longer than its blade, and tried to stay awake and vigilant. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember was the sag of my bed as something heavy clambered close to me. My nose was overpowered by a reek like damp fur and rancid meat, but I didn't dare to move. For a couple of seconds, I lay stiff as a corpse, with Cooper's hot breath sweeping across my face. Then, it spoke. "Do you want to see me?" The voice was guttural and gravelly, like if a bear could talk. "See you? What are you?" I whispered. "What do you want?" "Do you want to see me?" it repeated. I screamed. I heard my mother's hobbling footsteps and felt awful for waking her, no matter how horrible the cause. The thing lowered its voice to a growling whisper as my mom fumbled with the door. "If you say yes, you can't take it back." "Cooper," my mom put her hands on her hips. "Get down from there, this instant." "I'm sorry," she laughed. "He's just not used to other people, you know." "Mom, what does Cooper look like to you?" "Well, honey," my mom scratched her head. "I mean, he's hard to describe. Like a standard dog, I guess." Why? Why would you ask me that?" "Well," I stammered, I can't see him. Can other people see Cooper?" Dead silence. Then, "How would I know? It's not like I can take him for walks at my age." "What do you mean you can't see him?" My mom stalled. That's just ridiculous." "Come on, you must have noticed that something's off," I pressed. "Like people look at you funny when you call him or play with him outside, or when the mailmen or Jehovah's Witnesses or Girl Scouts or whoever comes to the door, they just act like he isn't there, right?" The thing beside me didn't like this line of conversation at all. I felt it gently but firmly place a paw the size of a dinner plate on top of my stomach. Even with all the adrenaline running, I recognized that signal for what it was. A warning. One of those claws would open up my intestines like a sharp knife slicing through sausage. "I don't know what you're talking about," my mom snorted after a long pause. But I could tell that I was onto something. She couldn't see Cooper either. My mind flashed back to those stainless steel dog dishes out back, to the missing cat sign, to the 2 kids who'd vanished in this very neighborhood. "Mom," I chose my words carefully, "how did you find Cooper? What does he, eat?" "One day, I just heard him on my doorstep, whining and wagging his tail, so I told him he could come in." Mom put her hands on her hips. And he's not expensive to feed, if that's what you mean. Unlike you when you lived under this roof. Cooper takes care of himself. Are you sure Cooper doesn't get into any trouble? Or what do you mean? My mother's expression changed to one of genuine worry. Honey, you're scaring me. You don't want to scare Mom, do you? The thing snarled, so low that only I could hear it. As it did, it dug its claws into my stomach, ever so slightly. Nah, I faked a smile. It was just a bad joke. I'm just tired. I'm sorry. Well... My mother looked at me uncomfortably. If you still don't feel right in the morning, I can call Dr. Strauss. You know, the one you talked to when you had that incident back in high school. Did you know he's still practicing psychiatry, even at his age? I think you went to class with his daughter, in fact. She's a doctor now too, you know. I felt the invisible claws tapping impatiently on my very exposed belly. I whimpered. Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna try to sleep now, and it looks like Cooper and I are getting along a lot better, huh? You sure are. My mom finally smiled again. It was a tired smile, though. The years of careworn wrinkles I'd given her were clear, even as she switched off the light. Good night, honey. Feel better in the morning. With the lights off and the door closed, I was alone in total darkness with my mom's special pet. For a time, the heavy mass beside me just lay there, breathing heavily, its claw holding me firmly in place. After my mom's tottering footsteps fell silent, however, it nuzzled close. A huge, rough tongue licked the side of my face. "Aww," a mocking growl hissed into my ear. "Who's a good boy?"